It was the kind of winter morning that looked like silence had finally learned to wear skin. Everything outside my window branches, rooftops, even the edges of parked cars, was glazed in a thin veil of frost that caught the light like crystal dust. I used to call mornings like this God's pause, when I still believed in things like mercy. The train station bench was colder than anything I'd ever sat on, and I've sat on a lot wooden pews during my late husband's funeral plastic waiting chairs, in hospitals, metal benches, and parks, watching children who didn't know they belonged to me run and play. But this one felt like an ending. My son-in-law Henry had just driven away with a wave that was too cheerful for someone who knew I had no wallet, no phone, no idea where I was headed. Said they needed a break and thought I could use some time to clear my head. I smiled then too. Reflex. Muscle memory from years of surviving conversations I wasn't meant to have an opinion in. I didn't cry. Crying is for people who still expect something to arrive when they signal distress. I've learned over the last decade that distress often echoes in empty hallways, that people will sigh more at your sadness than lean in. When my stroke happened 3 years ago, it was like someone took a rubber band and snapped it against time. One moment I was in my garden pulling up onions, the next, I was on my kitchen floor, tasting metal, unable to move the right side of my body. My daughter Clara and Henry moved me into their home afterward. We'll take care of everything Clara had promised, and I, scared, grateful, naive, had handed over my bank access, my house keys, even the password to my email. They meant well at first. Most people do. The erosion didn't happen in one wave. It never does. First, it was, let me handle your Social Security payments, it's easier. Then it was, we'll just consolidate everything into one account to simplify. Eventually, I was being handed a $20 bill every other week, like a child getting allowance. I couldn't even buy my own tea. But the real theft wasn't the money. It was the erasure. You don't need to worry about that anymore, Mom Clara would say, if I asked about my property taxes or my old investments. You'll confuse yourself. Henry would add, reaching for the remote, changing the channel as if the subject itself was an intrusion. They took my voice before they touched my wallet. I should have known the day I heard Clara on the phone whispering, she still thinks it's hers. But denial is seductive. Denial speaks in your child's voice and wears your grandchild's smile. It burrows in the spaces where you once held them as babies and makes you believe that submission is a kind of love. But you can only be patronized so long before your bones begin to rebel. It started small. I remembered the password to my old email. I used the library computer while they thought I was reading in the community room. Then I checked on an old brokerage account they probably assumed I'd forgotten. Millions. From my husband's life insurance, from investments I made quietly during the years no one thought I was doing anything at all. I let the balance blink on the screen for a long time. I didn't smile. I didn't cry. I just felt something shift, like finding a key in your pocket when you thought the door had long since rusted shut. That was 6 months ago. Today, Henry left me on a bench at the train station. But I knew he would. He'd been dropping hints for weeks how tired Clara was, how tense things were with me in the house, how I didn't seem to want to contribute anymore. As though my worth were measured in how quiet I could be. But they don't know everything. They don't know I made a new account, that I quietly hired a lawyer who specializes in elder financial abuse, that I've been documenting every instance, every receipt, every manipulated transaction. They don't know I've spoken to a housing coordinator for seniors with means, and they certainly don't know I've already purchased a small cottage outright cash from the account Henry didn't know existed. They think they abandoned me, but I'm the one who left. And now, as I sit here in the cold, I'm not waiting to be rescued. I'm waiting for the 10:43 train to Milltown. I'll drink chamomile tonight in a home where the only voice I answer to is my own. The train to Milltown arrived 3 minutes early, but time had already become something I carried differently. I boarded slowly, pressing my hand against the rail to steady the weight of 72 years behind me. The young conductor didn't meet my eyes when he offered to help with my small suitcase. I nodded anyway. It felt like mercy, not pity. As the train pulled away, the bench where Henry left me faded from view. It reminded me of a grave marker, unmarked but definitive, a place where something once sat and would never return. The landscape slipped past in a blur of grays and browns, a watercolor of barren trees and rusted fencing, but I didn't look away. Grief, even when it doesn't surprise you, has its rituals. Watching that station vanish was one of mine. I don't hate Clara. People expect me to when I tell the truth in small pieces to the few who've earned it. How could she, they ask, outrage curling at their mouths? I only smile faintly. Hate requires energy I no longer spend on what does not nourish me. Besides, I raised her. Not alone, no. But long enough to know how silence in a house becomes currency. Long enough to know how a woman learns to trade her voice for peace until the day she forgets what her voice even sounded like. Clara learned by watching me. That is the bitterest truth. The train's gentle swaying almost lulled me into sleep, but I kept my eyes open. I wanted to memorize this moment, the moment I became real to myself again. There had been so many years I didn't recognize my own thoughts until they came back to me in someone else's words. I'd overhear Clara at dinner telling her friends I used to be sharp, or that things had started slipping. Maybe they had, but not because of age. It was from not being seen. That's how a person begins to disappear. My new home is modest, a single-story stone cottage nestled at the edge of a quiet forest road. The woman who sold it to me had a widow's kindness. She didn't ask many questions, just said, "It's been waiting for someone steady." That was how she described me. Steady. No one had called me that in years. The first night I sat in the kitchen after unpacking, cradling a chipped mug filled with chamomile tea. I didn't turn on the television. I didn't play the radio. I just listened to the ticking of the wall clock and the sigh of wind against glass panes. It was the sound of my own company. And I found I liked it. The hardest part came a few days later. Clara called. I didn't answer. Her message was polite at first, almost sugary. "Hey, Mom, just wondering where you are?" We were worried. Then hours later, another voicemail. This one tighter. More clipped. "You really think this is funny? We've been looking everywhere. You didn't leave a note." That wasn't true. I had left a note. She just never bothered to look in the old sewing tin where I always kept important things. When she finally said it, it came as no surprise. "Look, we need to talk about the accounts. There's some confusion here and we need to sort it out. Henry's been handling your finances and things are kind of tied up. You can't just walk away from responsibilities." I didn't respond. Instead, I mailed her a letter through certified post. Simple, clear. My accounts are now managed by legal counsel. Please direct all future communication through them. I wish you peace. The rage came back, of course. More voicemails. A visit from a mutual friend who'd heard you've gone rogue Marian. Rogue. As if reclaiming what was mine meant betrayal. I listened. I nodded. I offered her tea and walked her to the door. I didn't need to convince anyone anymore. That was the real freedom. Some mornings I still wake up expecting the tightness in my chest that came from living in someone else's space. But now it's the birds that greet me, not judgment. I dress when I feel like it. I walk through my own door and decide how the day unfolds. I've begun painting again. Just small canvases. Still lifes mostly. There's something sacred about putting color where there was once only shape. I paint bowls of fruit that never rot chairs, that never scrape angrily across floors, hands that hold but do not demand. Yesterday I painted the train bench. But in my version, it sat empty under a sky bright with possibility. No luggage, no shadows. Just the suggestion that someone had risen finally and left for good. I once read that grief is love with nowhere to go. But that's not quite right. Grief knows exactly where to go. It coils around the places that have been emptied, wraps itself tightly around our ribs, and sits quietly in our morning rituals. Mine visited in the way I automatically reached for 2 mugs each morning before remembering I was alone. It crept into the soft echoes of my daughter's voice that my memory refused to evict. But even grief, like all things, softens when exposed to the sun long enough. One morning I walked the half-mile path that wound from my cottage to the small lake hidden beyond the birches. It was early spring by then, and the first green shoots had started pushing through the loam like children testing the edge of sleep. My joints ached, but I welcomed the feeling. It reminded me I still lived inside this body and that it still had things to carry. There's a tree near the water, old and crooked, with a bench carved into its roots. I sat there with my thermos of tea and let the warmth bleed into my palms. No one came by. That kind of quiet used to feel lonely. Now it felt like a secret too sacred to share. I thought about the Marian I used to be before the stroke, before Henry's soft voice turned firm, before Clara's concern turned to control. I used to be full of opinions on books on politics, on which plums were sweetest at the market. I used to volunteer at the library, teach ESL classes at the community center, and write letters to the editor that made some folks very uncomfortable. I wasn't invisible then, just small in the eyes of the people I loved. But that woman had not disappeared. She had only been buried beneath layers of compromise. And now, sitting by that lake, I began to unearth her bit by bit. A week later, I joined a reading group at the Milltown Community Center. Most of the members were women around my age or older, all of them with stories they wore like shawls, frayed, warm, woven with stubborn threads. We read poetry and memoirs. Some afternoons, we didn't read at all. We just sat with cups of lukewarm coffee and talked about the past like it was a shared town we'd all moved out of. One woman, Joyce, wore too much perfume and cursed in church. I adored her instantly. Another, Annette, had lived with her niece for a year before moving out for the sake of both our souls. We didn't talk much about the exact nature of our exits, but it didn't matter. The knowing passed between us in glances, nods, pauses that held more than words. I told them about my paintings, about the lake. I didn't tell them about Clara. Not yet. It wasn't shame that kept me quiet. It was something more complicated. A mix of mourning and guilt, perhaps, or the quiet dignity of reclaiming a story too long told by someone else. I needed to own it first before offering it up for others to weigh. A letter arrived one Thursday afternoon. It was from Henry, not Clara. I recognized his sharp, forward-leaning script. Inside was a single page. We never meant to hurt you. We were overwhelmed. You weren't yourself and we thought we were helping. Maybe we overstepped. Clara misses you. So does Emma. If you ever want to come back not to live, just to visit, we'd like that. We're sorry, Marion. Truly. I read it twice, then once more aloud to the empty room. What struck me most wasn't the apology, though. Rare it was not without precedent. What lingered was the careful phrasing. You weren't yourself. As though I had ceased to be when I stopped being convenient. Still, there was a part of me that missed Emma, my granddaughter. Her laugh, her questions, her way of curling up beside me with a book that she'd ask me to read with your eyes. Grandma, not your voice. I didn't write back, not right away. Instead, I wrote a letter to Emma. Dear heart, I live by a lake now. It's quiet and I'm learning to be quiet too, but in a good way. Like the quiet that happens before music starts. I think about you often. I hope you're being kind to yourself and asking big questions. Maybe one day, if your heart wants it too, you can visit. I'll teach you how to make rosehip tea and how to listen to frogs when the stars come out. Love always, Grandma. I folded the letter and sealed it in an envelope with no address. It sat on the table beside my tea for days. Sometimes it's enough to write something true, even if it never gets sent. ChatGPT, Jun Noi. It was on a Sunday morning with a soft rain brushing the cottage roof like fingertips on old paper that I finally opened the second bedroom closet. I had avoided it until then, claiming I didn't need the space, but in truth, it felt like a door to some forgotten part of myself. I had stashed things there hastily when I first moved in, a few photo albums, a box of scarves that no longer matched anything I wore, a binder of legal documents, and a cardboard crate with my name scrawled in thick marker M. Davies, Archive. The word struck me, archive, as if I were already history. Inside were clippings from my younger days, mostly newspaper articles I had written for the local paper decades ago. Columns about school board controversies, profiles of shopkeepers' editorials on community gardening. My name was always printed modestly. Marion Davies, contributor. I had forgotten how proud I used to be of that byline. I found an old journal wedged between two dated copies of the New Yorker, its spine cracked and pages yellowed at the corners. The entries weren't long, just impressions. A stranger's compliment, the way a particular bird moved across the garden, fragments of conversations I'd overheard that had moved me in small, unexpected ways. Reading them felt like sitting across from a younger version of myself, one who still believed that being observant was her superpower, who found whole universes in how people held their hands or hesitated before speaking. That girl had believed deeply in her right to take up space. Somewhere along the line, I had started apologizing for it. The next week, I brought the journal to the reading group. We had just finished discussing a memoir about a woman who left her marriage at 70 to backpack across Portugal. Joyce had snorted through most of it. "I'll walk across Portugal when they start making wine out of ibuprofen," she'd said. We laughed. But underneath the laughter, I saw something else, a flicker of longing we all understood. When it was my turn to speak, I held up my old journal.
"I used to write," I said quietly. "I mean, I guess I still do. Just not out loud." I read them a short piece, one from 1983 about watching Clara fall asleep in a sunbeam on the living room floor. The way her breath had sounded like the tide, soft and certain.
By the time I finished, the room was silent. "That was beautiful," Annette said, dabbing her eyes with a crumpled tissue. "Why'd you stop?" I hesitated. I didn't think anyone needed my words anymore. Joyce, who never minced hers, leaned forward. "We all need someone who's watching closely." That night I started writing again. Nothing grand, no novels or memoirs, just letters. To the women I used to be, to the girl who married too young and learned to compromise too early, to the mother who said yes too often, to the widow who had to remember how to sleep alone. I wrote them all, then folded them neatly and tucked them into the same box where the old journal now lived. A record. Not of pain, but of awakening. A few weeks later, I received another letter, this time from Clara. Her handwriting was shaky. The envelope smelled faintly of her perfume, the same one she used to wear when she was 16 and wanted to be noticed.
"Mom, I don't know what to say anymore. I've listened to your silence for too long, and it's louder than any argument we've ever had. I guess I just want to say I'm sorry. I'm sorry for how we handled things. I'm sorry we made you feel small. I see now what we did. And if you ever want to talk, really talk, I'm here. I miss you. Love, Clara."
I stared at the letter for a long time. Not because I didn't believe her, but because I finally understood that believing her didn't have to mean going back. Sometimes people are sorry. Sometimes they aren't. But forgiveness, I've learned, doesn't require permission. It just needs a place to land. I wrote her back 2 days later. "Dear Clara, thank you. Your words mean more than you know. I'm in a good place now. A whole place. I'd be open to speaking with honesty and on equal footing. If we talk, it will be as two women, not mother and daughter, defined by old debts. I love you. That never stopped. But I love myself now too. And I'm not giving that up again. With warmth, Mom." I mailed it on a Monday, then spent the afternoon painting. This time I painted a table set for one with a steaming cup of tea, a thick journal, and a window looking out over trees blooming in late spring. The caption I wrote beneath it in faint pencil. Being alone is not the same as being forgotten. The summer rolled in quietly, as if not wanting to disturb the peace I had carved from the chaos of before. The trees surrounding the cottage had fully leafed out, casting a dappled shade over the stone porch, where I now spent most mornings sipping tea and watching the world pretend it wasn't spinning quite so fast. There's a strange grace in reclaiming stillness. I had spent so many years in motion, cleaning, cooking, explaining, apologizing, that I forgot what it meant to just be. Now I woke with no one to impress, no one to pacify. I wore loose linen dresses and let my silver hair do as it pleased. Sometimes I looked in the mirror and saw a woman I didn't recognize but admired nonetheless. Emma, my granddaughter, sent a postcard in early July. A drawing of a frog on a bicycle with the words, "Grandma, I saw this and thought of you for some reason. I hope you're having fun being mysterious and wise in the woods. I miss your stories. The handwriting was unmistakably hers, though a bit taller than I remembered. She had always been the observant one, the one who noticed when I was tired or when the smile I wore at dinner didn't quite reach my eyes. I pinned the card to my refrigerator with a magnet shaped like a tomato and let it warm the room for days. Later that week, I walked down to the little local market. I had become friendly with the woman who ran it, a quiet soul named Miriam, who always wore her reading glasses on her head and never asked more than she offered. She set aside my favorite tea biscuits and always asked how the lake was doing, as though it were a friend we both shared. That day she looked at me over the register and said, "I heard you were a writer." I blinked. "That's generous. I wrote some things. A long time ago." She smiled gently. "There's a notice up at the library. They're looking for someone to lead a memoir workshop this fall. I thought of you." I started to protest some tired reflex about being too old, too out of practice. But I caught myself. That was the voice I'd inherited from years of being dismissed. I didn't need to carry it anymore. "I'll think about it," I said instead. But I already knew I would go. That night, I reread the letter I had sent to Clara. I hadn't heard back, and that was all right. I wasn't waiting anymore. I didn't need her answer to feel the solidity of my own. Grief still visited from time to time, but now it came like an old neighbor, brief, familiar, and oddly comforting. I no longer pushed it away. I let it sit beside me for a while, then saw it to the door with a nod. One evening, the phone rang. I almost didn't answer. I had grown used to the silence, protective of it even, but something made me pick it up. "Hi." The voice was soft, hesitant. "Clara." She took a breath. "I got your letter. I've read it a dozen times." Silence stretched between us. This time it wasn't heavy. It was honest. "I didn't know how far we'd gone," she said, finally. "How far I'd let things get. Henry, he didn't mean harm, but that doesn't excuse anything. And I didn't stop him. That's on me." I leaned back into the chair. The breeze carried the scent of lavender in through the window. "You're right," I said. "It is on you. But I don't need penance. I just need truth. I can give you that, or try to." We talked for half an hour. Tentative. Careful. Like two women meeting on the edge of a long and wild river trying to build a bridge from the same pieces that once broke them apart. When I hung up, I didn't cry. I didn't feel triumph. I felt still. Settled. That was enough. Later, I stood outside and looked up at the sky. The stars had started to bloom across the darkness, constellations stitching stories. Only those patient enough to look could understand. This was the life I had built, not in reaction to anyone else, not in defiance, but in declaration. A life chosen, not inherited. I hadn't just escaped. I had returned to myself. Tomorrow, I'd visit the library and offer my name for the workshop. I'd bring my journal. I'd tell the women in that room what no one had told me for too long, that it is never too late to be the author of your own story, not even when others have tried to write it for you. And then I'd go home, to my lake, my garden, my quiet. And I'd keep writing.